All right, we're live. Hello, and the microphone's working this time?
Excellent.
Nice. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first of hopefully many in a series of specials. My cigar went out. Nice. I'm going to call these audio specials. They are Hyper Premium Presents an audio special. Hyper Premium Presents will be a larger project. We'll see how it plays out. Today with me, I've got my friend Chris. He's a good buddy of mine from church, and we've got some expertise in a topic I think is interesting. So today we're going to do an interview. We'll see how long it lasts. We may break it up into one or two. We may have a single conversation. I might break that up. We don't know. We're going to see how it goes. But yeah, that's the gist of the situation. Chris, if you want to give yourself a quick intro and maybe tell the people who you are and what you do and what your field of expertise is and why you developed that particular interest.
Sure. Yeah, glad to be here with you. My name's Chris. I wear a bunch of different hats. Not the one that pays the most, but the one that is most like a career is that I'm an adjunct professor of English literature. So I've been teaching for about a decade now, mostly online. Teaching for a couple of different programs right now for a university. So I particularly enjoy teaching ancient and medieval literature. That's near and dear to my heart. This semester I'm not. We're reading the moderns.
How do you feel about the moderns?
Some of them are great.
Okay.
Some of them are great. But it doesn't warm the cockles of my heart quite as much as Beowulf and others. So yeah, I'm also out here in East Texas. I have a small farm, live out there with my wife and kids. So I have runaway goats this morning.
Oh boy. That's got to be the most obnoxious of all runaway animals.
They ran away closer to us.
Okay.
So that was convenient.
That is nice.
But I didn't get them back in the pen.
Okay.
And I probably won't till tomorrow, so I'm just hoping they don't go too far.
Okay.
We'll see.
Yeah. I was on my way to Dallas a couple days ago, and it was the first bout of traffic I've seen out here outside of Tyler in a while. And somebody had a pretty substantial piece of a tree fall down and take out their fence. And 4 very large, very beautiful horses were wild and free.
Yep.
Just totally untamable. Up and down the side of the road.
Oh, yeah.
Panicking. No, the people were panicking.
Right.
But they were having the time of their life, dude. They could not have been more excited about what was going on.
One of the most horrifying experiences I had as a farmer and as a father was when, am I too loud? I don't know how to read.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Your levels are great. And if it is too loud, I can go back. Like, this records separately, so I'll keep them separate in editing, and then I can change the volume in post.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, we had a couple of horses for a while donated to us by my cousin.
Okay.
And one day I was out trying to move them into another paddock, and they got loose, and they just took off. They were like, "Oh, freedom!" This is amazing. And so they're galloping full speed across down the road. And as I look at them as they're running across the field, he must have been 3 years old. My 3-year-old son is standing there in the middle of the road.
Oh boy.
And I think that is the most scared I've ever been in my entire life. And then they moved out of the way and didn't trample my son.
And
he moved out of the way too. He
good.
saw,
Okay.
These 2 tons of horse running at him.
Yeah. I'm glad you figured that out.
I should get out of the way.
That's funny. That's funny.
And then the horses came right back. They're like, "All right, we're done. Put us in."
We just wanted a John, dude. We're done. We know this is where we're gonna get fed. We're not trying to get away. That's exciting. Yeah. Cool. So we exchanged some emails about what we might talk about today. And I think one of the things you mentioned, as we started that conversation developed, I think we both kind of got interested in when I was talking to Jason this morning about us having a conversation, the way I described it was that we were going to kind of talk about the imagination and psychology of maybe more educated or literate people in the medieval era. You specifically mentioned Beowulf. Beowulf or Beowulf? How do you say it?
So in modern English, we normally call it Beowulf.
Okay.
In Anglo-Saxon English, it would have been something like Beowulf.
Okay. So give me some historical context behind Beowulf.
Sure.
Do we know who wrote it?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, and we don't know a whole lot. There's a lot of speculation about who wrote it,
Okay.
when it was written, why it was written, how many people wrote it. It's a pretty romantic story, how we actually got the manuscripts. And this is one of the cool things about the medieval period is the way manuscripts come down to us and like what they thought was important to save from the classical period and from their own periods.
Yeah. Okay.
But there was a guy, I believe his last name was Cotton.
Okay.
He had this huge library and he had a fire and almost everything was destroyed. And the Beowulf manuscript was in there. So it's bits of it are charred, but it survived. And we have one manuscript of it. I think that was in the 1600s or something.
Okay.
Yeah, Beowulf is a fascinating poem. One of the things that really interests me is that my take on it is that it was a well-known story, like an oral story,
Okay.
that Anglo-Saxons would tell to each other over at the mead hall over their fires, but was written down by probably a monk.
Okay.
And there are a couple of reasons to think that, mainly because monks were pretty much the only ones that were writing things down
Okay. Yeah.
at the time. Yeah, but it's a fascinating little poem with all the elements that an English professor likes, like great story, great poetry, fascinating narrative devices, and all sorts of things. And then everything like a teenage guy wants. You've got monsters and bloodshed and arms getting ripped off. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And so obviously people are telling each other this story. These people that are most often telling each other this story, I would imagine, are illiterate. They can't read or write.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it, I don't know the answer to this. I would imagine most people don't know the answer to this. Is the language it's recorded in, is that the same language it would have been told in as a...
Yeah,
Okay.
Or very, very close to it.
Okay.
So it was written in what we call Old English, and that was the language of England for about 500 years, approximately.
Okay. Is that something you would, like, I could be able to look at and discern, or is it too different from modern English?
It is very different.
Okay.
You would be able to recognize words.
Okay.
So like there's a lot of overlap. A lot of our grammatical terms come from Old English.
Yeah.
A little more akin to Elizabethan English, but Normans invaded in 1066, and we got a bunch of French into the language that reshaped it, French and Latin. So
Okay. Yeah, that was who was the Norman prince who took over? What was his name?
William the Conqueror, I
William
believe.
Okay, yeah. I was just watching a YouTube
Don't
video.
fact check me.
Okay, I think you're right, because I was just watching a YouTube video about
Yeah.
it, like not even a month ago.
I mean, the guy's named the Conqueror. There's a good chance.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a good chance he did it. Yeah. So, do we think we think we have like a rough estimate of when it was written, or when it was recorded, at least?
Yeah. I believe the manuscript. Some of the best guesses are early, sometime around 1000 AD. Okay. Some scholars put it a little earlier, and a lot of, if I'm getting my academic work correct, a lot of people think it was probably written down 100 or 200 years before that, but probably around 800 to 1000 AD.
When did the Romans lose control of the British Isles? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't. It was certainly waning in the 500s and 600s, maybe. So I'm not certain of of an exact date, but I guess somewhere around the 600s, 650s.
Okay. So we're talking about quite a few generations between the fall of Roman control and the birth of whatever civilization that created this epic.
Not necessarily the birth of the civilization. The civilization existed already.
Oh yeah,
and the Romans weren't. Their control over Britain was constrained by barbarians.
Sure.
So of course Hadrian's Wall, for instance, was built across northern England to keep the Picts out because they couldn't quite conquer them all and exert their control over them.
Okay.
So the culture that out of which Beowulf comes exists contemporaneous to the Roman Empire, but became dominant as their power collapsed.
Okay. So, I mean, tell me more about that culture. What is for a person, for the average person in this culture who's hearing Beowulf? Are they hearing this? Like, how is this like they're going to the movies as a family on a Friday night type situation? Is this a special occasion? They're around eating a meal, or is this something that is a story like this more akin to maybe one of us reading a Narnia book to one of our kids before bedtime?
Most likely it was a story for the elites to tell to one another. Okay. So you'd have to call it a court would be maybe a little exaggerated, but the kind of culture that's captured in Beowulf that we shouldn't take to be an exact representation of historically what actually happened, but good poetry is often more interesting than history anyway. But at least I would argue reflects what the the lords amongst the Anglo-Saxons want to think about themselves, how they want to think about their culture, and the culture that came before them. So their ancestors, the great kings of old who they want to imitate.
Okay.
So probably this would have come up in a lord's house, not exactly a castle, but he'd have his retainers, his great men, possibly their families who are part of kind of the upper crust of the Anglo-Saxon world. And stories like this would have been circulated among them.
And as they were telling this story, are they telling this story as, are they experiencing this as a piece of history that happened to their people for sure? Or are they entertaining this as a myth?
That's a very good question. Probably some of both.
Okay.
And one of the interesting elements of the medieval world in general, and it's spanning the whole period, is the ways in which myth and history, poetry and science all kind of blend together. And a lot of thinkers and writers don't seem as interested in teasing out the individual strength, or maybe are not even conscious of those being different things.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot more we could unpack there, but a lot of the elements, presumably, if you're a cynic, presumably the Anglo-Saxons were not expecting gigantic monsters to sweep in and grab hold of 30 men and tear them apart necessarily. So there are mythical elements, but a lot of the politics of Beowulf, the picture it gives of how a king works, what he's expected to do, I think that's pretty true, at least to how they'd want to think about themselves.
Yeah.
There's this may be getting too much into the weeds, but one of the things that I've written about regarding Beowulf is the role of gift giving, and so kings are always giving gifts to each other, or giving gifts to their retainers, and then the retainers will win treasure and give it back to their lord, and there's a constant exchange of gifts going on, and it plays a really interesting role in the poem. Probably not representative of how their society actually worked,
Sure.
but it reflects the kinds of relationships that they're sort of trying to build. As a king, you have to earn people's loyalty. They have to demonstrate their loyalty back to the king, and this is one of the sort of poetic devices of capturing that. I could say more about it, but it's
I mean that is exactly what I'm looking for, is like that kind of into the weeds. What was life like for them, and how are they structured? Because I think one of the things that's really interesting to me is that there's C.S. Lewis has quote, I don't know which book it's from, or even if it's from a book, it might be from an essay, but he talks about how in the modern era people often have this way of thinking about themselves as being more intelligent or more educated or whatever than people from a time in the past. And I think that I certainly don't doubt that there was a time where that was true, where what he was talking about was true. Like, obviously that was probably then. My experience now is at least many people on what I would describe as being like our side, or like people that are close to our sense of the world, or share a culture with us, tend to almost lionize people of old to be even smarter than us. And so the thing that interests me in all of this is that I'm very motivated by and interested in finding out if that's true. Finding out if my theory is that they were just people like us, and they had their own sense of the world that was flawed and excellent, and they had maybe ideas of nobility that were phenomenal in some ways and faulty in others, and there was just as much cowardice and just as many heroics today as there are back then. And so I think digging into the weeds like that is like a great way to open up to people a broader sense, because I think like history, looking back on history is a little skewed, because you're going to look at the times that are the most entertaining or the most significant, great battles, great men. And so you can get, just like looking at like social media and getting a sense that there's something happening in the world that may not be happening, because you're getting the most, everybody's filtering up the parts of their lives that are the most interesting, when their day to day is quite banal. I think getting into the banal of people of that era, I think is what I'm fascinated by, and I think that's part of the reason why I'm really interested in diving in with you about like what did they think about themselves? What did they think about the world around them? How did they make measurement of, like you said, the stars and the ocean, and like what are their ways of describing the world around them? And is it really that significantly different from if you move away from the specifics and look at the kind of broader the implications of what they were saying? Is it really that different from how we metabolize the world around us mentally today? And so I think digging into that kind of stuff is exactly what I'm looking for. And with that, I would like, one of the questions I would have to say is, we talked about for a second the court and these how they're communicating these stories to each other. One of the things that I'm intensely fascinated by, that I can't find an answer to anywhere, is what are these communities of elites even like, really? Like, how are they? I mean, this kind of exposes my level of stupidity, but like, if you watch like Vikings on the History Channel, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think I've seen an episode or two. I'm not very familiar.
When the show started, it was good. It got whack fast, obviously, but like the first couple seasons, it was at least entertaining. I have no idea how accurate it was, but it was at least, it held my attention. But one of the things that struck me was that the environment that these people operated in, these communities were rather small. Mm-hmm. Like you'd have these groups of elites, call them cohorts or whatever you wanted to call them. There's like 12 people standing in this, like, it's like the king sitting on like just like a wooden chair.
Yeah.
It's not, there's no reality to it. There's no gold anywhere. He's sitting in a room of stone, and there's like it's like his boys. It's just like him and his buddies.
Yeah.
Like running a country. Right. Is that accurate? Is that what it was like?
Not running a country. And of course it varies across, the medieval period is a long period.
Right. And I understand that countries in the way we understand them today did not exist.
It was much, the Anglo-Saxon world, and I believe it extrapolates to kind of the Northern Germanic, Northern European world.
Let's pause. Actually, that's a great point. Draw me some geographic boundaries. What is the Anglo-Saxon world? Are we talking about just the British Isles, or is there?
So, functionally England.
Okay.
British Isles is kind of the Anglo-Saxon world. The name Anglo-Saxon comes from the Angles and the Saxons, who are actually on the coast of France, Saxony.
Okay.
There's a lot of interchange with Sweden and Denmark and areas like that. And Beowulf itself is actually set in Denmark.
Okay.
The two greatest English works of literature are set in Denmark. It's Beowulf and Hamlet.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, and embarrassing for England.
Yeah, but I thought Hamlet. Okay, I was thinking of. Wait, what's the one that happens in Scotland? What's the Shakespeare? Macbeth. Okay, yeah. Okay, all right.
The Scottish play.
The Scottish play, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So the Anglo-Saxon world is British Isles, but there's a lot of overlap with some of the Northern European world as well. Okay. A lot of it looks fairly similar as populations declined after the decline of the Roman Empire, but really it's the Roman Empire declines in no small part because of population decline.
Okay.
Things in much of France look different. Things in Italy and Greece looked very different. Okay. And the culture is very different. So there's a lot of nuance that would have to go in. And then, of course, over time, it changes a lot. Yeah. Around the time Beowulf is written, it's very tribal. So you'd have multiple kings. There'd be tons of kings coexisting.
Okay.
And they are relatively small. Beowulf himself, as he has 12 retainers that kind of follow him, that are his men. And of course, they've got their families, they've got their own men that they're responsible for. So if he needs to rally an army, he might be able to do so. But we're not looking at a king ruling all of England very effectively.
Okay.
So anyway, I'm speaking very, very broad terms. You can see attempts at that over the years. And as you get closer to the Norman invasion, you have something more like a sort of united country. But even then, the king's always reliant on much smaller lords to gather up their men and fight for him. And if they don't do that, he doesn't really have any power.
Okay. So when that occurs, when it's time to rally the men, how many are they engaging often with each other in these wars, or are the tribes interfighting most of the time? Is that what makes up most of the?
There's a lot of interfighting.
Okay,
and that's one of the themes of Beowulf. In fact, there's one of the things that always strikes me every time I read it is that it's a really bleak poem.
Yeah,
it starts. And it's a little distracting to students because the antagonists are not other men. They're not other people. They're monsters. Right? So we have Grendel at the beginning. The poem is really interesting because it introduces Beowulf. It introduces Hrothgar, who's the lord, the king of this land that is being invaded by Grendel. And as it introduces his mead hall, his capital, which is called Heorot,
okay.
Which effectively looks like Theoden's capital in in the Two Towers in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Tolkien is very much drawing on this world for
Okay.
his representation of Rohan.
Okay.
I'm going to lose my train of thought. So as soon as we're introduced to Heorot, his meat hall, which is like his castle, his throne room, where everybody gets together and they drink and have nice fires and whatnot and keep the cold English winter away. We're told that before long, after this story, it's going to be burned down by kinslaying. Like his Hrothgar's, I think it's his nephew, turns on him and wipes out his line and burns down his meat hall. And it's only then that we're introduced to Grendel. And I think the poet is very intentionally like, this poem's not about like how awfully cruel human beings are to each other. It's about this monster, but it's kind of the same thing, effectively. And at the end of the poem, we've all had, 1,000 years to read it now, so just to give some spoilers. Beowulf grows old, he becomes a great king, and eventually a dragon comes in and starts attacking his land, so he goes out to fight it by himself, which is not a particularly prudent move, as it would turn out. And he does it because he wants to win gold for his people.
Yeah.
But he ends up being killed by the dragon. And the poem ends with his dying celebration that he's won gold for his people and honor for his own name. And then after his death, as they're burying him, all his people are grief-stricken. Not just because they're sad that they lost their king, but it seems obvious to all of them that, in fact, very shortly, because they don't have a king to protect them anymore, they don't have this warrior, a warlord, the enemies are going to sweep in and devour them. Yeah. And they're going to be wiped out.
Okay.
So it ends on this really grim, hopeless note, despite all of Beowulf's individual heroics, which is kind of a recurring theme that ties Beowulf and the early medieval period, at least, back all the way to the classical period. I mean, the Iliad, for instance, is dealing with many of the same issues from 1,000 years before.
Yeah. I mean, let's tackle some of that. Let's tackle some of the issues that it is dealing with. So it's are people of that era, is violence a common experience for them, or are we having generations, or is there, maybe you go your entire life without seeing war, or is there, are you pretty much guaranteed to die by the sword? What is the average person's experience of violence during this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably you're not guaranteed to die by the sword.
Okay.
But it would not be unheard of to do so.
Okay.
Violence tends to break out normally for sensible reasons, right?
Yeah.
One tribe's population grows, they don't have enough land to feed everyone, or they don't have enough money to buy the things they need. They go, our neighbors have those. Yeah. So we're going to go over there, and there are obviously a lot of complex motivations that go into that, but violence was certainly real. And the poem puts a heavy emphasis on that. Okay. There aren't really any characters in the poem that end well.
Yeah.
Not necessarily within the poem, but it's at least implied, historically. These are the poem, even though it's obviously fictional, is dealing with historical tribes that existed.
Right.
And so the readers of the poem would know, these guys got wiped out by their cousins, 50 years after this.
Okay.
So that was certainly a real part. Now, again, it's hard to know and I'm not a historian enough to know how much you can generalize to the sort of generic guy who, is working on a farm for his lord out. What are the chances that he's going to be killed? You don't normally want to kill the farmers and the blacksmiths and the people, you may, if you need to take their farmland, but if you've got a good farmer, you might just say, oh, I'm your lord now and you're going to serve me.
Right. But it was certainly a fact of reality for the elites at the time.
Yeah.
That death could very well come at the hands of someone you knew or someone, some neighbor.
Yep.
Okay.
And a really interesting historical element too. Are you familiar with the idea of the weregold or weregild?
No.
Weregild is an Anglo-Saxon word for, basically it means man price.
Okay.
Were is here the same prefix as in werewolf.
Yeah.
And they have this system that eventually develops in no small part because of the church, because tribal violence is really hard to stop.
Right.
So Bob goes over to his neighbor's tribe and gets into a fight. Maybe they had too much meat and whatever. Knocks him over the head and kills him.
Yeah.
His neighbor's like, or his neighbor's cousin, like, Bob killed my cousin, so I'm going to go kill Bob or one of his cousins. And you start this cycle of violence. It's really, really hard to stop because of concepts of honor, because of concepts of duty to your family, to your tribe. It's very, very easy for that kind of violence to escalate really, really quickly.
Right.
So this concept of weregild develops, where instead Bob goes over and kills his neighbor, and his neighbor says, I'm either going to kill you or you pay the weregild, you pay the man price.
Okay.
You make restitution
Yeah.
for whatever crime you've committed. And so you get this really elaborate system of weregild. So the Anglo-Saxon Doomsday Book, which is one of the best named texts of that period, includes, it's actually I wouldn't say a boring book, but compared to like Beowulf and The Wanderer and other great poems of the period, one of its features is just a long list of all the different members of society and what their price is if you kill them.
Oh, really?
Like,
that's
a
crazy.
king is worth this and a bishop is worth this, etc. And then you get down to like the farmers and they're like a fraction of the cost. You know? So it's really fascinating because violence is a part of their life in a way it's not for the average person in East Texas.
Sure.
But they know better than just to let that violence cycle out of control and perpetuate. So there are real strong social pressures to kind of keep a lid on it.
Yeah.
To make sure we don't wipe ourselves out.
Certainly.
All of a sudden. And so I mentioned gift giving earlier. That's one element of it. So it's kind of parallel to the weregild. But instead of making restitution for a crime, you're sort of... it sounds too mercenary to say like buying loyalty.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's really that kind of transaction. Like I'm going to hire you, but it's really, I'm going to give you a gift. I'm going to show my generosity to you. And there's this sense of obligation that entails. Like, this guy has been really good to me. He's given me gold. He's given me land. He's given me the means to provide for myself and my family and my people. So I have a debt of honor to him. So I'm going to defend him from outside threats. And I'm not going to just willy-nilly turn my back on him or stab him in the back, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So there exist these societal features to try to keep the peace, to try to establish order. I mean, you have to have those, of course.
Certainly.
I think there are two weird tendencies. It's really easy to idealize the past and romanticize it, which I do all the time because I love the medieval world.
Yeah.
I don't particularly want to go back to Anglo-Saxon England. it sounds pretty rough. 1300s in Florence or something. Oh, that was pretty bad in Florence, actually. But there are some wonderful periods of high culture, beauty, relative peace. And it's easy to romanticize it. It's also easy to slip into the opposite trend. They're just barbarians,
right,
who don't have any concepts of virtue, of justice, of polity, or anything like that. And that's just not the case.
Right, of course. Well, here's a question for you that might even help dig into that, which is to help establish how these ideas of virtue played out practically. So we have we have kings and his retainers, and I guess maybe even to play off this idea of gift giving, the king has these gifts that he's trying to give, but he's obviously has someone to give the gift to, and so that would indicate to me that there's, at some point previous to that, there was some kind of mechanism to decide how these men were going to be elevated to the point of being special enough to gain attention from a king, to gain a gift from a king. So, and I don't know if this is too specific of a question, maybe it is, but how did that play out? How are these groups of people, villages, wherever these retainers? I guess that's a good first question. What are these retainers? What are they in charge of? Are they in charge of a football field of land and there's a village on it with farms surrounding it? Are they when they're pledging their loyalty to the king, what are they bringing to the table? What do they have usually?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know that I can safely answer it historically.
Yeah.
Because I don't have enough of a historical background. What I gather from Beowulf in particular, so caveating this with the fact that this is going to be a fictional representation of themselves, but assuming that there's some correlation between how they want to represent themselves and how they actually are, which I do. I'm pretty optimistic that those correlate pretty closely, but
yeah. I mean, our modern fiction tales correlate. I mean, obviously, like a Marvel doesn't, but like,
yeah.
Jason,
but even Marvel gives you, it tells you something real about the way New York.
Right,
City
there are cities and people walking around. Yeah, certainly.
So, what's first and foremost draws a thane, that's the Anglo-Saxon word for a retainer.
Okay.
A thane to his lord is an ability and willingness to do violence for him. But my sense is we don't really get a good economic picture in the poem of like how these people survived, who's growing the food and whatnot. But I think the implication is that they are, and that's how the system developed into the feudal period in the later medieval world.
Right.
The lords who functioned pretty much the same way, the Knights of the Round Table, for instance, are landowners. They have, sometimes small bits of land, sometimes hundreds of thousands of acres, and they have tenant farmers that work for them, and some of that gets taxed and goes to the king. So while the poem itself doesn't tell us a lot about it, I think the implication is that there's a lot of overlap between those roles.
Okay.
So you are a thane who is willing to fight for your king. When you're not fighting and not just hanging out drinking mead in the mead hall and telling good stories, you're probably trying to establish a community that can actually survive, grow food, and etc.
And so these communities, I would assume, most likely are made up, like the primary operating unit within these communities are families, I would imagine. Yeah. So this is, the thane's family might be presiding over a dozen other families who are either landowning or something similar to like a tenant farming on his land, something like that.
Yeah, very few would be land owning. And I don't even know.
He would be like
land
the primary
ownership was a real concept at the time. But so normally it functions something like they'd be more like serfs.
Okay. Okay.
They'd have whatever number of people living on the land, and they'd give some portion of whatever they grow and make and whatnot to their lord.
Okay, and then their
that
lord
would
checks up to
pass it off.
Okay.
And then the king, in his generosity, would give some back. And there'd be this wonderful
cycle
flourishing
of,
and exchange until something goes wrong.
Okay. So how is there anything in the literature of the time that reveals to us at the level of a thane how these families are deciding who is the best among them? Is this just the man who's the most capable of violence amongst other men? Does he have some other? Is there some sort of microcosm, some sort of smaller type of thane to his lord? Sort of this thane is wealthy, starts establishing positive relationships with the families around him, gathers some sort of social clout through gifts and interactions, and then eventually becomes a favorite of them? Or is it what? How is it? Is there some blend of the two?
I don't know.
I
don't know. I will tell you what Beowulf, what the poem itself shows.
Yes.
The whole story is about Beowulf coming from another kingdom because
Right.
he's heard Hrothgar is in trouble.
Okay.
And he's motivated partly because his family, his father and his king had previous relations to Hrothgar. So there's kind of a relationship of kind of duty bound or honor bound to go help.
Okay.
But he wants to go make a name for himself. He wants to go show that I'm going to stick up for you, and then you will see that I'm a valuable person.
Okay.
You'll reward me.
And he has men with him, correct?
Yes, he does.
Okay.
He comes with something like 30 men or so. I don't recall if there's a
And so these would have been his men directly, like he would have been a thane, and these are the men that he could raise to his banner.
Yeah, he's a leader.
Okay.
He has men subordinate to him who follow him.
Okay.
He's also a retainer of his own king, whose name I'm... Hugelac.
Okay.
Is his king's name.
Okay.
Who it turns out did not authorize him to go and help Hrothgar. There's some contention there.
Okay.
There's some interesting politics. But, so Beowulf goes to make a name for himself, to kind of demonstrate his value. And the poem at least implies that he's successful. He goes over, he defeats Grendel and Grendel's mother in these heroic battles. And then after he returns home, he eventually becomes the king.
Okay.
After his own lord dies.
Okay, so he does not take over.
He does not take over Hrothgar's land at all.
Okay.
Actually,
that's that. I thought he married Hrothgar's daughter and then became. Okay.
No, it's actually quite interesting. After rescuing Hrothgar, who's portrayed very positively in the poem,
Yeah.
but there's kind of an ironic silence about the fact that he's not able to defeat Grendel himself. He's not able to protect his own house.
Right.
But after Beowulf rescues them, Hrothgar and Hrothgar's wife, whose name is Wilthil.
Okay.
I'm just guessing on the pronunciation, but it's something like that.
Yeah.
They reward him with gifts. They actually kind of go, they sort of have a battle of gifts.
Like who can give him a better gift?
Yeah, Hrothgar gives him these great gifts, and his wife is concerned. This is not obvious in the poem. It's something I have written on and tried to make the argument for, that his wife is concerned that Hrothgar is trying to set Beowulf up to inherit his kingdom.
Yes.
But Hrothgar has sons.
Right.
So his wife is like, no.
Yeah.
We have kids who are going to inherit the throne. They're not, because they're going to die. But they don't know that.
Yeah.
And then Beowulf takes all these gifts and goes back to his king, and his king seems kind of worried that Hrothgar's bought Beowulf's loyalty.
Ah, yes.
And like, actually, you're my retainer.
Yeah.
And Beowulf's, yeah, I'm absolutely yours. Here, take all these gifts that I earned. They're yours.
Okay.
And gives them back to his own king. I forgot if there was a more general point, but there's an interesting depiction of how you make a place for yourself in this world.
Yeah.
And the last example of that is at the very end of the poem, when Beowulf goes out fighting this dragon. He has his own retainers. He's given them gifts, and they're supposed to fight for him, except he says, actually, I'm going to go out and fight this dragon by myself.
Yeah.
I'm going to win the glory if I'm not too old. This is 50 years later. And all of his retainers but one, named Wiglaf,
Okay.
let him go off and fight the dragon. When Wiglaf sees that it's not going so well, he jumps into the fray. Before he does that, he rebukes all the other retainers. He says, your lord has just thrown away the gifts that he gave you. He gave you armor and swords and gold and rings and all sorts of fancy things. And it's just like he tossed him in the dump, because in his hour of need, you're just standing by. So Wiglaf jumps in and rescues Beowulf, helps slay the dragon. And it's implied by the poem, thereby kind of earns the role, the responsibility that Beowulf's now lost. So Wiglaf is at least a prospective king to inherit his throne as a result of stepping up in his hour of need and sort of repaying the gifts that Beowulf gave him.
Okay.
Again, gift giving is a real historical part of how Anglo-Saxon societies function. In the poem, it's sort of portrayed as the way that these relationships are built. I think historically there are many other factors that go into it as well, but the poet at least wants to emphasize this. So
this is certainly a theme he's concerned with.
He's concerned about. Yes. I think he's concerned about it because he thinks it's an important part of his own culture.
Yeah. Which I think is revealing in and of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly. So, how to formulate this question? Let me think about how to actually put it into words. So, we have, I guess actually a good way to start the series of questions is to ask you more about what you think the nature of Grendel, of his mother, of the dragon, what does this reveal about what the people who were telling that story saw as being threats to themselves, existential threats that could be represented by these monsters? Mm-hmm. What did they represent to these people? What were the aspects, either metaphorical or literal, of Grendel that made him what I imagine would be quite a terrifying idea to the people telling the story to each other? Mm-hmm. What were those characteristics?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There's sort of so the way it's handled literarily by a lot of professors, like Grendel is sort of the manifestation of just the existential threat, and the dragon would function this way too. This existential threat of violence at every turn. Just the possibility that at any moment these sort of fragile bulwarks against violence that we've established in our culture might crumble. Outsiders might come in. Our neighbors might turn against us for whatever reason. And Grendel's mother, in particular, represents is maybe the wrong word, but evokes the hazard of kinslaying, tribal violence that can cycle out of control, because her function in the poem is, you killed my son, now I'm going to come and wreak havoc on you, and that cycle just continues on and on.
Yeah.
So I think those are real elements that the poet is probably conscious of. I think it's not an obvious... I don't think we should treat it as obvious that they thought of these monsters as fictional in the way that we will as moderns.
Yeah.
I don't mean that I think they really thought that the threat that they might face next weekend was this terrifying spawn of Cain coming in and tearing them apart. But for most of the medievals, all the way up through the Renaissance and even into the, relatively not that long ago, the world was a very populated place by all sorts of, supernatural and spiritual. Spiritual is not exactly the right word. Supernatural is not exactly the right word. Creatures that are not just of the same order as human beings and animals.
Yeah.
And so certainly the poet thinks these are sort of thematically important and representative of something in their society. Certainly they just thought monsters are cool. We can tell cool stories about these.
Yeah.
And yet I also think we as moderns would too readily just say, oh, they wouldn't believe this. And I'm waffling a little bit because I'm not even sure how strong of a case to make, but I don't think they would disbelieve in monsters like this in the same way that we would disbelieve in monsters like that.
Sure.
I could say more about this. Is maybe a topic for another time, but that touches on a lot of things throughout the whole medieval period about sort of how they see the world and, again, sort of how it's populated. And so you get into some very interesting things.
I mean, let's get into some very interesting things. How did they, what, to them, to the best of your knowledge, how was the world populated? In their minds, were there instances of something that maybe supernatural is the wrong word, but I certainly don't have a better word for it. Were there creatures out there that existed that were certainly beyond the scope of an animal or a human?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I think this is the case possibly in every period through human history up until the Renaissance and the post-Renaissance Enlightenment world.
Yeah.
I was just reading a book that was written in the 1600s called The Secret Commonwealth of Fairies, Fauns, and Elves.
Excellent.
And it's, I want to say the guy's name is Robert. His last name's Kirk.
Okay.
Which is funny because he's a priest in Scotland.
Nice.
Yes, Scotland or Ireland.
For those who don't know, Kirk is the what's the language?
Scots.
So it's Gaelic for church.
Yeah,
correct.
That's right. Yeah, so he's an Anglican minister in the 1600s, post-Reformation, writing an account of his parish's sense of this, what we would call the supernatural world.
Okay.
That to them is not exactly supernatural. So it's creatures, he describes them as sort of in between the natures of human beings and angels.
Yeah.
So angels are spiritual creatures. We're material creatures,
right?
Obviously with a soul. And in between, because nature abhors a vacuum, there's never just an empty spot.
Yeah.
It's full of all sorts of crazy creatures
that we may or may not be able to interact with, and that may or may
very
not.
Few people can. He talks a lot about seers who have the ability to see them and interact with them. Usually it's the seventh son of a seventh son, which Kirk was.
Okay.
Which may be why he was particularly interested. And he's sort of an interesting kind of skeptical writer.
Yeah.
Who obviously thinks that a lot of the beliefs of his parish and his congregants are utterly ignorant and silly. And they're like, he has this very funny treatise on their attempts to cast spells to keep them away, and it's garbled Latin, quotations from the Psalms and things like that, and he's like, this is just nonsense.
Yeah.
But he's like, but obviously these things are real and they surround us all the time. And they were terrifying things. Like they're constantly harassing and kidnapping people. And, he doesn't say much about creatures like what we called succubi, for instance. But like doing terrible, evil, creepy things that even in a kind of early modern world, he just sort of takes not quite for granted anymore, but nevertheless assumes is a real part of the world, a real part of human experience, even if it's not a very common thing. And he's writing very, very late. I mean, this was 300-400 years ago, as a lot of the scientific revolution is starting. Our concept of a kind of bifurcated world between matter and anything else, spiritual, supernatural, whatever it may be, is forming. I think for most medieval people, that bifurcation did not exist.
Certainly.
That there were a lot of things that we would tend to be, rightly or wrongly, fairly incredulous of, that they would just take for granted. It's interesting, like, as a Christian, you have to maintain a pretty strong commitment to there being supernatural realities.
Sure.
But as modern people, it's still very, very bifurcated. And we even don't think of ourselves very often as supernatural creatures. For the medieval person, we are that, right? We're matter. We're an animal with a soul.
Right.
So we share things with kind of the base material things of this world and with the angels, and the intelligences that guide the planet and all sorts of things. We're a weird kind of hybrid.
Yeah.
I'm going off on a tangent. There are a lot of things in there. I can maybe tease out some other threads.
Again, tangents are great. Tangents are great. Here's a question that may get us on another tangent, which is, I don't know the timeline at which Christianity begins to take a hold in the medieval era. So by the time that people are sharing the poem of Beowulf with each other, is Christianity involved in this culture at all?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly. Christianity comes to largely as a result of the infrastructure of the Roman world.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I thought.
It comes very early.
Okay.
What success it has, like to what degree it's dominant or a minority in a culture, varies from time to time and place to place. But in England, Christianity comes very, very early. It gets established. It's constantly fighting against both sort of intra-Christian heresies. Arianism was very common in the Northern European world.
Okay.
And, of course, paganism.
Right.
But Christianity begins to exert more and more influence. It doesn't look a lot like Christianity in our day and age.
Certainly.
Which is fascinating. But it's certainly there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. How much at the point at which historically people are sharing at least this poem with each other, how much of their religions, of the pagan religions that they had in the past, are still gripping their minds, gripping their psyches? Is there a pretty large, substantial portion of what they think and believe that's remnant of their pagan religions?
Yeah, it's a hard question. It's a feature of the poem.
Certainly.
So, for instance, the poet, the narrator, makes several allusions to the fact that his characters are ignorant of their creator, or ignorant of the hope, or they'll go and offer sacrifices at their pagan shrines, which they don't know are the devil
Yeah.
but they are in fact.
In the poem.
In the poem, yes.
They are the devil. Okay.
And so some scholars will say, well, that's just a later edition. Somebody came in and wanted to Christianize it. I don't think that's the case.
Okay.
I think that probably as early as the poem is being told, it's being told by Christians, even if that Christianity is not fully suffused into their culture and into their minds.
Okay. But these are people who are aware of Jesus Christ, who are regenerate. They are likely regenerate Christians at this point. People who are having these conversations, telling these stories.
Oh man, yeah, I think so.
Okay,
I think that's fair to say. You know, there's so many instances of people. You know, a bishop comes or priest comes, and there's a mass conversion. Everybody gets baptized. Sometimes this leads to radical changes in the culture. Sometimes they look exactly the same 50 years later as they did right before.
Yeah.
So again, you know, it doesn't look like Christianity in the modern, or even in the last, you know, in the early medieval period, it looks very different than in the late medieval period when Christianity was the dominant force and Christendom reigned.
Right.
Even then, of course, you still have, you know, Christians doing all sorts of, you have popes doing all sorts
Yeah,
of
certainly.
completely nut things, just absolute madness, right?
Yeah.
And to my mind, you know, as a good sort of American evangelical, it's like, what in the world is this? How exactly can you're like going to church and then the next week you're like, oh, I'm going to go invade my neighbors over here who were also in, you know, church with me last week. You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, good. Well, I mean, I think that lends even though obviously the Christianity is very different from the one we would expect. I mean, or the one that we experience. Yeah. I think it's. I mean, I feel like it's like outside the scope of rationality to expect it to be like our
absolutely.
Christian.
I mean, I think the early church looks radically different.
Certainly,
modern Christianity.
Certainly. Yeah, but I do think that does help lend some perspective, at least to other Christians, of how these people may have thought about themselves, how they may have seen the world. How much exposure would they have had to the earliest forms of the Bible? Would they have had any access to any letters Paul wrote, or would they have had any access to the Old Testament, anything like that?
Not the average person. They would have only had any access to that through ecclesiastical leader, you know, through monks passing it down.
Okay.
But let's see, I'm trying to remember.
When did the Council of Nicaea occur?
Nicaea was in there were two, I think it was 330 and 360.
Okay, so the Bible existed effectively.
Yeah.
Before this period that we're talking about.
Well, total tangent, but it existed pretty thoroughly before the Council of Nicaea as well.
Okay, it did? Okay, cool. So the Bible we have today existed.
Yeah, it absolutely existed. Monks were copying letters. They were copying scripture.
Okay.
And the medieval period even early medieval period is full of, you know, absolutely beautiful copies of scripture.
Okay, so it was
King Alfred, who is one of the Anglo-Saxon kings, translated a lot of scripture into Old English.
Okay.
So we don't have a full Bible in Old English, but there's at least the Gospels, I believe Exodus, and maybe Genesis as well, and a smattering of others.
Okay.
Exist in that language.
Okay, but it is certainly something that would have been disseminated amongst and known by the leaders of this culture.
Yeah, not disseminated in written form for the most part.
Right, certainly.
Yeah,
but they're talking about it. They have exposure to it. They know what it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that is a huge piece of context that helps us understand, because I mean, you know, it obviously forms much of how we think.
Yeah.
And it's the same book. So,
just come back to Beowulf briefly. There's this really interesting part where Beowulf dives down into this mere, this lake, to kill Grendel's mother, and after killing her, takes a bunch of treasure, one bit of which is a sword.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an inscription on it about... my memory's not good. I believe it's about the flood.
Okay.
And he gives it... Beowulf gives it to Hrothgar, who looks at it and is in awe, but of course he probably can't read it. He doesn't... And historically, he doesn't know anything about Christianity at this point. He's not he's a pagan king,
right?
As the poem makes clear. But again, it's part of their world, and so the poet at least knows it. The poet assumes his audience knows it,
yeah.
Even if they also assume the characters are not familiar.
Okay.
So anyway, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean that's revealing. Certainly revealing at least about the poet and about the people that are talking about this poem. Because again, I mean, I think we are talking a lot about the specifics of what's going on in the poem and what the poem reveals about the people at the time. But I think I want to make clear here that we are still discussing not the people that are the culture that's necessarily in the poem,
right.
But the culture of the people sharing the poem amongst themselves. So it is far more important to consider what the people hearing the poem would know or what they would be thinking about than what the characters themselves would know or be thinking about. Right. Yeah. So I'm trying to think again how to formulate this question best. The people at the time, being the elites at the time, I keep saying the people at the time, but I keep forgetting to distinguish between the average person and the elite. The elite person at the time has at least significant part, maybe not substantial, maybe not most of their worldview or whatever informed by Christianity or by their faith, but some part of it would be recognizable to us as a Christian ordered idea of the world. But obviously that isn't necessarily wholly true. And one of the things that was really interesting to me, I think you and I have talked about this briefly, and this is, again, I feel like this is like I'm like showing my level of uneducation, but that hideous strength. Mm-hmm. To me, the character of Merlin in that hideous strength is incredibly fascinating, and his sort of like the references that Ransom makes when they're having their conversations about the sort of pagan things that were against the rules, but because they weren't necessarily like, it wasn't necessarily fair to impose those rules on the people at the time. It's okay that Merlin has these powers and can access this thing, but in the modern era, no one ought to touch these things.
And of course, Ransom there says they weren't necessarily very good for you either.
Right. Yes, certainly. Right. And so that begs the question to me at what because one of the ways that I view literature and storytelling in general. I mean, I know that they didn't have like the novel in the way we like write books and tell stories now. That was not something that they had engaged in yet, but. I still think, and maybe this is obvious, maybe this is a stupid thing to say out loud, but to me it still seems that like the utility of telling these stories is the same. Like maybe the method at which, or the way we use the tool, or the tools themselves are slightly different, but the utility behind them is still similar. And so there's this like, I guess I would say like there's a sort of larger narrative that's tied together through all these stories that has been included even in our era, post World War II West, where you have, to me, I guess what I'm saying is that that hideous strength does not exist in isolation from Beowulf, but is a continuation of the same narrative, if that makes sense, in a way.
Yeah.
Because there's this sort of psychological, I mean, not to get like new agey or like I guess not new agey, but and even saying not to get Jungian is not necessarily bad, but like there is a sort of collective unconsciousness that does appear in the canon of the West, maybe that's like this sort of narrative progress. And so the question that I have often is, at what point is the cutoff where the access to these powers is it's now fair to say, oh well, we ought not be accessing these sort of pagan rituals. These things are cut off. And is there a point, because it seems like to me, in my understanding of history, and maybe this is unclear, maybe I'm making this question unclear, but I guess I'll try my best. It seems to me that it was in the medieval era that point occurred. Mm-hmm. And so I would be interested to hear about what you think they thought about that point. Did they see that point when it occurred, or did it happen sort of subconsciously, just culture evolved and Christianity took more and more control and things got more empirical perhaps, and the elements and the weather and everything became less spiritual during the Renaissance? Is that something that they would have perceived as a conscious thing they were doing, or is that something that during the medieval period just sort of happened to no one's notice?
Okay. Yeah. So if I'm understanding right,
was there a time when someone was hearing Beowulf and going, listen, just quit telling the story, man. We get it. Our dads thought that was a cool story or whatever, but we all know now there's no monsters, nothing like that. We should at what point did they start to think that story was lame enough to stop telling, I guess is.
I think, and I would make the argument, and I'd mainly sort of be plagiarizing Lewis here.
Okay.
That one of the features that Lewis talks about in his book, The Discarded Image, about medieval people, one of the things that marks the medieval mind, especially the literary mind in particular, the people who are recording things, writing things, transferring human knowledge through time,
right,
over the generations, which the only possible way to do that is either by word of mouth or in writing, which
right,
is
a recent invention, kind of,
but very prevalent throughout the medieval world, right?
Sure.
So
certainly.
Even before the printing press, the medievals are determined to record as much of the classic world, or what they thought was the classic world, as possible. What they thought from the classic world was important, and by important, in part, congenial to Christianity.
Right.
Whether we would also agree that it's congenial to Christianity is a timeless debate.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm very sympathetic to the medieval sensibilities on these issues, but Lewis draws a lot from Owen Barfield. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all. He was a professor, I want to say at Oxford. Okay. Really fascinating guy. And he lays a lot of the groundwork that Lewis builds on for That Hideous Strength in particular, but Lewis's thought in general. Lewis basically makes the case that it's throughout the medieval world. It's not until you get to the end of the medieval period that you would encounter a lot of skepticism about a story like this, about the vision of the world, at least many features of the vision of the world that it offers. And it's not a growing progressive understanding of Christianity that changes it. It's the Enlightenment. It's especially scientific developments that shifted. One of Lewis's most underread works, mostly because it's gigantic and very dense, is this book on what is it called? Literature and Poetry in the 16th century.
Okay.
It's a huge book. One of the things he talks about, for instance, is that contemporaneous with the scientific revolution, really Newton and other figures in that same time period, is a really strong interest in things like alchemy.
Yeah.
Sometimes by the same people.
Yeah.
Many of whom are Christians who saw no conflict in their attempt to, I mean, kind of to my mind, like cast spells.
Sure.
And to control the world.
Yeah.
They thought they were doing the same thing when they were doing scientific experiments, early chemistry, things like that. So for Merlin, for instance, I don't really think it's till you get to the end of the medieval period in the Renaissance world that Lewis would say that age has ended.
Okay.
For better or worse. And he kind of brackets away the truth question, like whether this is real or true or not. Just that's not where we are anymore.
Sure.
And Owen Barfield basically says there's been a revolution in human consciousness.
Yeah.
As far as I understand him anyway, which I'm not an expert on Barfield by any means. But he says we just conceive of the universe and ourselves, human nature, our own identities in fundamentally different ways. Other writers like Charles Taylor, for instance, who's a lot of Christian, very popular among certain Christian circles, gets at this in a very different way, but is kind of identifying the ways in which we just think about the world in terms given to us by the scientific revolution.
Yeah.
And not just the sort of boogeymen amongst Christian, like evolution or something like that, just a dichotomy, for instance, between matter and anything else.
Sure.
We even have a hard time, this is just my own thought, but the way we even think about ourselves as a human being tends to be fairly materialistic.
Right.
Like, the medievals have this really robust conception of the human being as a supernatural creature who has a soul that's purely supernatural, connected to a body by this third thing, which is the spirit, which is like a hybrid of those two that combine or allow the material, the base stuff that we're made of, to intermingle with the supernatural,
okay,
the spiritual.
Yeah.
And we just don't have categories to even make sense of that anymore. It just sounds like
Certainly.
gobbledygook.
Yeah, certainly.
Again, it's a whole nother set of questions whether or not that's a good way of thinking about who we are. But one of the things that I love about the medieval period is just that it gives us, and this is a very Lewisian sort of notion, it gives us an alternative to the zeitgeist that we're just raised in, and like, oh, there are other ways of conceiving of the world, who we are, etc.
Yeah.
All of which, again, for most of the medieval people, they would have absolutely thought this was not just compatible with Christianity, but implied by it. The hypostatic union of Jesus Christ, God becoming man.
Yeah.
If he can do that, we can also be united with our material bodies and spiritual souls. Another thing, maybe far afield, but I was just reminded of it from Barfield, that he talks about is the way the medieval concept of the whole universe was much more, he uses the term participatory.
Okay.
And it's much more animate. The world is full of living things.
Yeah.
Or things that function like living things. So gravity, for instance, Chaucer describes things falling to the ground because they have a kindly inclining to go down.
Okay.
But
yeah.
they sort of will to go down.
Yeah.
We're like, we'll describe this in purely mathematical and physical terms. Rocks are pulled towards gravity, etc. The planets, the stars are all planets have angelic intelligences, that exert influences on human beings because they are all connected. We're made of our base bodies, our material bodies are made of the four primal elements, like everything else.
Yeah.
But there's just this weird sense that everything's sort of intermingling and exerting influences and powers on each other. I mean, our word for flu, right? This is pretty well known, but we call it influenza. It's the influence of the planets on our bodies that cause illness.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's not well enough known for me. I mean, I'm kind of an idiot, so it makes sense that I didn't know that, but that's interesting. Okay.
And I've maybe distracted myself from my own train of thought, but
I was just telling Jason, this is not losing your train of thought is the practice when it comes to like broadcasting.
Yeah.
I say, well, I interrupt you mid train of thought.
Yeah, just so this very robust sense that the universe is alive, not in sort of a pantheistic, trivial sense,
Right.
but we are surrounded by things that are at least kind of analogous to human agency, spiritual agency, however you want to articulate that. And we participate in that. This is the world that God has created. He's sort of established certain archons to rule over different spheres of human life. So, for instance, Boethius, a very kind of late classical, early medieval Christian thinker, talked a lot about fortune.
Yeah.
Which is like sort of God's angelic authority over the world of change and human life, that makes sure fortunes kind of average out in the end. Like, you'll get material blessings for a while, and then fortune's wheel spins, and now you were at the top, now you're at the bottom. That's just kind of the way things go. We sort of, in modern terms, a Christian vision, we tend to think of God's providence, but there's really no intermediary between human life and God's providential control.
Yeah.
And for the medievals, that was not a reasonable way of thinking about it. Okay. Not because God couldn't do that, but the way he chooses to engage in the world is through intermediaries.
Okay.
Because God's really, really far above us.
Right, certainly.
And there are all these other things, kind of higher, less material things in between us and God.
Yeah.
And so God's will, his control sort of filters down through these different stages. The spheres. We talk about the music of the spheres, and that's not just a sort of pretty concept. This is the structure of the universe for a medieval person.
Okay, so they even, maybe this is a childish analogy, but they even viewed God's reign over reality in a sort of feudal way.
Yeah,
that there was still, God didn't exercise his specific will over each individual as much as he exercised his will over these regions or territories of reality. And there were, did they view these intermediaries as having deity? Like were they just sort of clumps of order that kind of acted without their own will?
They're much more analogous to like angelic powers, and sometimes explicitly are so. So the intelligences that govern the 7 planets, were thought of like angelic intelligences. So a good, or the way I often think about it, is that this is basically what Tolkien is doing in his Legendarium, in the Silmarillion. So we've got like Iluvatar creates,
right,
but then he creates the Einar,
right,
and the Maya, and they sort of filter down, and they are in charge of, they're sort of vice regions of the world,
right. And which there is some sort of biblical support for ideas like this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so they weren't just pulling this out of a hat.
No, absolutely
certainly not. Okay.
There is a metaphysical reason that they think that's fitting, or that ought to be the case.
Okay.
And we just don't have a metaphysics anymore.
Yeah, certainly.
for worse, I think. I'd say for better or worse, but it's clearly for worse.
Yeah, I would say, which actually leads me into a question I've been sitting on for a couple minutes now, which is that these ideas that you've just mentioned are have obviously faded from the zeitgeist that we experience today. And while I think, well, here, let me say it like this. The perception, I think, that people get taught in school and that they carry with them throughout their lives is that with the fading of these ideas came progress. And so the question I would pose to you is, do you think that progress was able to occur given God's grace in spite of the loss of these ideas? Or do you think that progress was married to the loss of these ideas?
No, I think it's that,
or maybe even not. Saying progress makes it seem like I'm saying it's like it's positive.
Yeah.
But like this change from
the things of the modern world.
Yeah,
right?
the things of the modern world, like this sort of empirical material. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in large part those are responsible for the fading of this vision of the world.
Okay.
That don't work to disprove it in a philosophical sense.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, so there's a really wonderful book by Joseph Minnick, who's a Reformed Christian writer. He used to live in DFW area. Called Enduring Divine Absence.
Okay.
Wonderful little book. And then he has a more recent one called Bulwarks of Unbelief, which I've not gotten around to reading yet, but it's on the same theme. He makes the case, I think very, very persuasively, that he's specifically addressing the question of the sense or plausibility, sort of inherent plausibility of God's being, God's existence, and our sense that that's sort of a natural assumption.
Yeah.
He talks about that fading and vanishing in the modern world, such that atheism is a sort of live, realistic choice that a lot of people can make, and even Christians can feel is sort of a real pressure.
Yeah.
And he makes the case that in no small part, this is a result of the developments in our material conditions and our technologies, that as we exert more and more control over our own lives, and that our lives are more and more constrained by our own creative technological prowess, the intuitive sense that a medieval person would have that I'm not in control, that this whole world is given to me by other more powerful, higher creatures, higher beings than me, just doesn't intuitively make sense to us anymore. Yeah. Not because an apple fell on Newton's head and all of a sudden like, oh, I don't need God as an explanation anymore. Not that Newton ever thought that. Sure. Yeah. But that is how, that's how new atheists would talk about it 10, 15 years ago. Like, well, God was just a hypothesis to explain the world around us. Now we don't need that anymore. Yeah. His argument, and I think is exactly right, is that in fact we're kind of blinded to what the real question is, because when we look at the world around us, mainly what we see is our own ability to control it. Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's it's very comfortable for our material existence. Yeah. But it sort of puts shutters on what we're able to recognize as what I think is still just kind of the base givenness of reality, that it's transcendence all around us, all the way down. Yeah. We just, we can sit in this dark room, right, with air conditioning. We're shuttered off from the world. This is all man-made. Right. Like, we've created a little environment for us. We can create a sense of control that's totally false. Yeah, and not without benefits, of course. Right, certainly, but it does not. Yeah, I think that one of the things that I just thought of right as we're speaking here is there's this.
one of the points that I made recently with Jason was that this is like totally off topic, but it'll come around. I hope, as long as I don't lose my train of thought. Is that there's this today in the modern era? There's a huge developing movement against like processed foods. And one of the points, and Jason and I talk about this a lot and work hard, and one of the things that the points I've made in the past is that in order to get to a place where we can feed 350 million people with healthy food, we had to go through this time where we were feeding 350 million people with processed crap in order to get to a place where we had 350 million people. And there was all this sort of the ultimate point is that I make is that we're in a time of reclaiming what many people took for granted around the ideas of health and around the ideas of food just 100 years ago.
Right.
And there's an analogous movement in the world of I hate to use the word psychology because I know that that's a big bugaboo, but I guess I would say psychotherapy. There's a big movement in that world that is reclaiming much of this sense of acceptance of we just have no, we don't really have control. And there's this, I would say that a like a therapist, I say in air quotes, everyone, I'm putting air quotes up, a therapist rightly ordered, his main like his whole goal is to bring his client to a place of being able to accept his own lack of control over his own life. Mm-hmm. And it's an odd place for that, I think, that idea to come from, and it's an odd way to have to really reinstill that idea into people. Mm-hmm. But it does seem to be, at least in my experience, because I'm close to that world, that's what my mom does for a living, and I've used psychotherapy to affect a lot of positive change in my life. And so but that's the core, kind of, as you get a couple, you get some reps in, there are different techniques you can use, but you do these things to work through your own baggage, and every good therapist kind of reveals at some point in the journey of their client, the client realizes, this is just all about me accepting that I have no control over anything, isn't it? And the therapist goes, yes, that is in fact the whole point of what we're doing here, is getting you to practice acceptance. And the first time I ever met with my therapist, I told him I was a Christian. He, although would not identify himself as a professing Bible-believing Christian, was very excited to hear that, because that means that my journey was going to be much easier.
Yeah,
because you're going to be brought to that level of submission much quicker. Right. And you have that sort of language already circulating in your head. And so it's extremely interesting, I think, for me to hear from you that is already been established as one of that sense of control over your own environment is one of the things that you would identify as being a primary loss that we've had since we've transitioned from a more spiritual or less empirical view of the world to a more empirical view of the world. So which, I mean, I think for me generates the question of kind of back to even how I was thinking about this conversation going before we started, was getting into the mind of and the psychology of a medieval person, where sorry, this is kind of happening live, so I'm rambling a little bit, but it's really kind of flow of consciousness, or whatever the expression is. Much of my time that I've spent thinking about people from that era is thinking about how awful it must have been for them to live in a world that was so ruled by chaos.
Yeah.
And now, as we're talking about it, I'm realizing that it probably wasn't that awful, because that was they by necessity practice this deep sense of acceptance and faith that we just can't even comprehend mostly. And so I guess my question for you is that something that you've seen expressed in their stories, expressed in the poems that they wrote, in the literature? Were they operating with this sense of acceptance of sort of, my life is not even my own?
Yeah, so I think absolutely that is the case.
Okay.
And the most interesting example that comes immediately to mind is Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy.
Okay.
So Boethius is writing at the tail end of the Roman world.
Okay.
And he is born into luxury. He's a Christian.
Okay.
And, gets on the wrong side of, I want to say Theodosius, but I could be mistaken about that.
Who's Theodosius?
He's an emperor.
Okay, that's I thought that sounded a little familiar.
And I believe it's at the period where they're I don't know for sure they called themselves emperors, but the Roman Empire is dissolving into the East and West. Rule is being divvied up. The central rule of Rome is basically a thing of the past. My history may be a little fuzzy, but
I mean, it sounds about right. I think
sounds plausible.
Yeah,
yeah. Anyway, he gets on the wrong side. He gets imprisoned and is eventually executed. And while he's in prison, writes this book called The Consolation of Philosophy, which is a dialogue between himself and Lady Philosophy.
Okay.
Who basically the gist of the book is he complains about his circumstances, and Philosophy explains why this is just the way things go.
Yeah.
And there are more important things than your comfort in life, your wealth in life, your reputation in life, even your life itself, that you need to be pursuing while you have the chance. It's interesting, throughout the medieval period, one of the things that I would most like to see, I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of the ressourcement movements going on right now.
I'm not.
Kind of the reformed world in Christianity and in Anglicanism amongst kind of thoughtful Protestants in general. There is probably a parallel in Catholicism and Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but there's an attempt to kind of go back to the roots of our own traditions and resource things from the past that we've sort of forgotten in the modern world. A lot of which I think is really good and helpful, as long as you avoid some of the romanticization of the past that is certainly still possible. But one of the things that I don't feel like we talk about very well is virtue.
Yes, okay.
And Boethius as one example, but medievals in general have this robust concept of virtue and vice that is so much more helpful to thinking about our own lives. And for that, and even as I think about it, virtue and vice, like sin is a really palpable, tangible concept for me.
Yeah.
And I am me. I have some experience with that.
Sure.
Virtues are very abstract.
Yeah.
And for Boethius, for medieval people, virtues are like real living things. I don't know exactly how to articulate it. One of the genres of the medieval world is the mystery play.
Okay.
Where you'll have virtues incarnate, right? Kind of come and engage with characters. Everyman is one of the famous plays, where you have a character called Everyman.
Okay.
Who is sort of allegorically just your average Joe. And virtues are these real tangible things. That hideous strength, actually, Lewis kind of sort of is, I think, trying to articulate this a little bit towards the end of that book. We tend to think of allegory as this. We're not good at allegory in the modern world.
Right.
Like, oh, you have characters that are sort of real people, and then they represent this other non-real thing, this abstract thing.
Yeah.
Again, that's a bifurcation that I don't think your average medieval Joe would recognize. Virtues are like living, tangible things that, in the face of all the things in human experience that are not in our control, that we have absolutely no say over, like Boethius in prison about to be executed, what we do have control over is the habits of virtue that we inculcate in ourselves.
Yeah.
That, right, God has made us with, as Augustine says, hearts restless until they rest in him. We have the good that we're oriented towards, that is manifest in these various virtues, and we are made to pursue those.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of control except in sort of the small little practical habits of virtue that we train ourselves up in. And again, for most medieval thinkers, those are just profoundly real in a way that I've been reading these guys for 20 some years now.
Yeah.
And my mind still is like, okay, this is a symbol for something else or whatever. Dante, for instance, are you familiar with the Divine Comedy?
When I was in middle school, I read.
You read the Inferno, didn't you?
Yes.
And you didn't read anything else?
I didn't. I didn't. It wasn't assigned reading. I just knew that it existed. Yeah. I read.
It's not your fault. I don't blame you.
Okay. Yeah. I got the. I think I had the full. I don't. I'd have to actually go home back to my parents' house and dig the book up. I don't know what, but yes, I read a small portion of it. I did not read the.
I consider it one of the most telling pictures of the modern world.
Okay.
That modern teachers across the West think it makes sense for us to assign to teenagers, college students, just the Inferno. That's the part that they'll get. They won't get the rest of it.
Yeah. Like, which part of the poem is the Inferno?
The Inferno's hell. So Dante wakes up at the midpoint of his life. He's 35 years old, and he's lost.
Right.
And he's lost the true path, the narrow path to God.
Okay.
And to get back to it, he has to go through hell.
Yeah.
Which is literally a descent into the center of the earth.
Yeah.
And then he climbs down Satan, whose feet are sticking up on the other side of the earth.
Okay.
And then he ascends up Mount Purgatory. And then he is elevated off into the celestial spheres until at the very end of Paradiso, the third book, he beholds the face of God.
Okay. Then I don't think I read the Inferno. I think I read.
Okay.
Oh crap! It's just so long ago. I'm trying to remember exactly which part of it was. He was talking to at some point he has a guide. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. So Virgil.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So Virgil features in the Inferno and in Purgatorio.
Okay. Purgatorium that's what I've read.
Interesting. So the Inferno, because Virgil is in limbo. Well, sorry, not exactly in limbo. He's in the first circle where virtuous pagans live.
Okay.
And they're sort of not in hell because they're really good guys.
Yeah.
But they weren't baptized, so they don't get to go up.
Yeah.
They don't get to go up. Yeah. So Virgil escorts him throughout hell and shows off all the different sinners in various spheres.
Okay.
And modern people are like, oh yeah, sinners, we can get that. This is great. And like sort of feel bad for all the sinners who are being punished. And
yeah.
For Dante, Inferno is important, but it's sort of a prologue to the things that actually matter, which is sort of the cultivation of personal, I don't know exactly what the word for it is, chastity, but not just about sexuality, just personal discipline.
Yeah.
That is Purgatorio, and then the cultivation of virtues, which is Paradiso.
Okay.
So that we can be the creatures that God made us to be and behold the beatific vision, behold God face to face.
Okay.
At the end of Paradiso. And yeah, modern people, I even, as much as I want to not feel that that's a real pressure on me too, we're very comfortable in hell.
Yeah.
And not with the cultivation of discipline and purgation and virtue.
Yeah. So a person of this era, what are their thoughts around their own will? Are they, because in the modern era, I think a huge idea that needs to be combated is that there's this concept that your will is unbound. You are totally free. You have completely free will. You can decide to do anything you want at any time. I would imagine that they did not hold to that idea. The question I have is to what extent, at what point did they become free to choose?
Yeah, of course they're
I guess the question I would ask is, these virtues are living things to them.
Yeah.
That are active and crackling and just pervasive throughout their world. Are they choosing to align themselves with these things completely? Are they a slave to these things in some way? Yeah. How do they identify with the virtues?
You want to make yourself a slave to them.
Okay.
Throughout the medieval period, especially in the later medieval world, there are lots of debates about the nature of the will and how it actually functions. And so there's a lot of disagreement. But I think the central thread is kind of an Aristotelian model.
Okay.
Because medievals loved Aristotle, and the medieval Christians basically thought he got everything right except that you need to believe in Jesus.
Yeah.
So we are oriented towards the good, the highest good, which is God.
Right.
And all things being equal, if we were not fallen creatures in a fallen world, we would just do that.
Okay.
And we would will to do that, but that's just the good. We would just pursue that.
Yeah.
But because we're fallen creatures, we can mistake other things for the good.
Okay.
Which, anytime you mistake something else for God, it's a vice.
Okay.
Anytime you choose something else over the highest good, you are in fact rejecting God and pursuing something vicious that's detrimental to yourself as a human being.
Okay.
And so Thomas Aquinas, I think, is probably the best exemplar of the way medieval people would think about this. And it's basically through the cultivation of habits, we can habituate ourselves more and more and more to vice, choosing something that's not God in God's place.
Right.
Or we can... It's not... I don't think he would think of it as just an act of will.
Yeah.
We can't just will the good because we're sinful creatures. But through God's grace, through the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit, etc., we can more and more habituate ourselves to see all these things as idols.
Yeah.
And orient ourselves back towards God for whom we were made. But once you do that, or once you start to do that, the point of cultivating a habit is because we're not really in control. We're not really able to make responsible decisions at every moment of our lives.
Right.
And for that very reason, we have to pursue the virtues and submit ourselves to them. So in a sense, sort of becoming a slave. And this is sort of Paul's language, right? We're slaves of righteousness.
Certainly.
We don't want to have a choice, because as soon as you have a choice, we're very prone towards making the wrong one.
Yeah.
As Adam and Eve in the garden. Right?
Very well proved. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm just thinking. I'm thinking about the implications of that. I'm thinking about we've gotten a little abstract.
Can I make maybe just one more thing that occurs to me?
Yeah.
Is that as questions of the will become more convoluted in the later medieval period, is exactly when you start to get into the modern era.
Okay.
So this was, of course, a very live issue in the Reformation for Luther and his Roman Catholic opposites. To what degree we have will, and I don't. There are those who will basically blame Luther, for instance, for all of the plagues of modernity. Charles Taylor, who I recommended or I mentioned earlier, and who I think very highly of, sort of falls into that.
Yeah.
And I think that's just silly. It's just that modern conceptions of the will are becoming live options. The concept of who we are as agents in the world is shifting for really complex reasons that I don't totally understand.
Yeah.
And that's one of the markers of the shift away from a medieval world into the modern world. Just very closely bound up with a lot of the other things we're talking about, and the chasm between us and them.
Yeah, the chasm between us and them is, yeah. I'm trying to wrap my mind around a cohesive question that doesn't take us into a realm of like going too far off topic, going too far away from the mind of a medieval person. And so I think, I mean, the historical context is one of violence, is one of a low level. I mean, I would assume it's a low level of individualism in the sense of how these people were considering themselves, what they're thinking about. Okay.
Certainly as we think of.
Certainly is right. And so these are groups of people who are bound tightly together through necessity, I would assume. Mm-hmm. And so what role does that have in the stories that they're playing, the stories that they're telling to each other, and the ideas that they have even about their relationship to God? Because I think in a modern Christian sense, evangelical Christianity has become, whether overly so or just enough, I don't know, but it seems to have become very specifically about your exact specific, Chris's relationship with God, Ethan's relationship with God.
My story, my relationship with Jesus.
Right. What's my testimony? Yeah. How has this relationship developed? Yeah. What did they have a different way of couching that? Were they thinking in terms of this is my family's sort of traditional relationship with the Christian faith, or we as a people are Christian? What was their... Because I guess what I'm thinking of is that in the story of Beowulf, the poet is obviously making a distinction between Christians and these people.
Yeah.
Does that... What's the weight there for them? Like, is there... It's almost like I'm kind of reaching for an idea that's so removed from us that I'm having a hard time even formulating a question about it.
Yeah.
So maybe this is too abstract or too strange, but...
Maybe so. I'm not sure how much... I don't know how much Beowulf in particular would help answer the question, but Christianity, as we conceive of it, again, as sort of, this is my individual relationship with Jesus, etc.
Yeah,
would be totally foreign. Christianity is almost more of... I think there is a biblical case for this as well, but it's more of an identity marker in the way that, like, we would think of being an American, for instance.
Yeah, right? Certainly.
Because for maybe Luther, for instance, would say, "Well, I was baptized." Like,
yeah.
Like, are you saved? Like, well, I was baptized.
Like, yeah.
And he doesn't just... I mean, he does partly mean I was baptized and therefore I'm regenerate and therefore I'm saved unless I apostatize.
Yeah.
But he also kind of just means that's who I am. That's who we are as human beings. Growing, in the medieval world in Christendom. So, obviously there are outliers as the medieval world increasingly interacts with the Muslim world and other things. But
yeah,
there's a sense that we are Christians, and it sort of doesn't have anything to do with me as an individual.
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly doesn't have anything to do with anything I've done. It's not that I've said a prayer or they would certainly articulate some beliefs.
Yeah.
And so there are obviously heresies that put you outside the pale of Christendom. And so there's overlap between our modern sense of sort of the individual having said a prayer or done a certain thing or believed a certain thing that is still true. But there's this much more communal sense. I've been baptized into the church. I participate in the church. I participate in its rituals. I go on Sunday. I take communion. These are the things that set me apart as a Christian.
Okay.
And I've maybe already lost sight of.
No, I think you've made it much better. You've brought it down to earth much more than I could have hoped for.
But there's a sense that it's funny because my sense, this is maybe debatable, and I might walk back on it if I think more carefully in a few hours. But there's a sense that all the things that we sort of emphasize as modern people, as individuals, the individual profession of faith, the individual prayer, whatever it may be, are exactly the sort of things that a medieval person would consider extraneous.
Okay.
Like, the things that are central are the communal, being baptized into the church, the sense that, I mean, for a lot of the medieval period, your engagement in public life was determined by being a member of the church. You were baptized. That's where you get your name. That's where you are enlisted on the rolls of people who are part of the polis, the community. All of that is sort of given to you.
Yeah.
It's funny because, of course, a lot of the Reformation debates become framed as the Protestant view as well. Roman Catholics are all just about sort of works, right? And you have to, earn your way into salvation. There's truth in that caricature, and yet for most medieval people, they're fundamentally passive in all this. They were baptized as infants, into the church, and they participate in its rituals. You can't go and say, actually, I don't believe that Jesus Christ is God, and still participate in those rituals.
Right.
But you don't have to. It's not about any of the individual acts of will that we associate with sort of evangelicalism.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah. No, I think that is poignant. That is an answer that it helps make the question more solid than it was.
One other thing that comes to mind, a characteristically medieval element of Christianity post-Reformation that has shaped the English-speaking world very profoundly, that I more and more appreciate, is the Book of Common Prayer that came out of Anglicanism.
Okay.
And Presbyterianism, of which I am a member, is an offshoot of that.
Right.
And so very closely connected. But the language of devotion, the things that we ought to be praying, is given to the individual. Like, here are the not that you can't pray other things, whatnot, but here are the things day in, day out at the church service that we ought to be praying, and we're praying them collectively.
Yeah.
And so we have a book.
Yeah.
And we can look at the book, and we all collectively participate in these prayers
Yeah.
that are our common prayers collected before God. And it's sort of, you as an individual need to participate in that.
Right.
That's good for your soul. You should do that. But it's not about my unique sort of imaginative, authentic,
sort of my experience of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even in, the very conservative Presbyterian world, that's not the way we think of it anymore.
Certainly not, right?
We're like, oh, actually, that kind of thing sounds too papist.
Yeah.
So we won't go there.
Yeah.
But that was just sort of a common sense way of thinking about it. For the Anglican world, that was actually, it's really fascinating because that doesn't exist in the Roman Catholic Church in the medieval period before that.
Okay.
It's, in many ways, a unique creation of the Anglican world. England got a lot of things right, though, so we should give them credit where credit's due.
Yeah, they did.
It's totally... It just strikes me as so weird in many ways. It's so foreign to the way that, as a 21st century person in Texas, I think about Christianity and
to relate to almost anything is such it's such a bizarre way. It's hard for me to even, as we're talking about this, I'm sitting here like trying to get in the head of a person who's like, maybe a member of the elite who's doing some sort of accounting for his people, or a guy working a hoe trying to get the farm in a correct place, trying to like sit in his head, like, and still operate as an individual with such a sort of communal mind.
Yeah.
Like, does this person even have an inner monologue? Like, is it just... Like, that's the thing you start to question is like, do they have thoughts? Are they just like rolling up to this like grander sort of computer that's like running the whole village together? Like it's such a bizarre thing to try to quantify in your head. And it's so, I think that's what makes it so fascinating is you're like, what were their actual, like, just base level thought? Like, did they ever think I'm hungry? Like, did they ever have that thought,
And I think it's certainly the case that, right, these are human beings. They're experiencing the world like we do, and yet
they are individuals.
They are individuals,
right?
And they have thoughts, etc., etc. But they're grounded to social norms and communal norms.
Yeah,
that we fundamentally reject.
Yeah, certainly,
and have just like wholesale tossed out.
Yeah, as
being important or guides, like a lot of the development of evangelicalism in the modern world, the revivals, etc., in the United States, for instance, are just rejections of this model of thinking that what's most fundamental is sort of our commonality or communal participation in these rituals.
Yeah.
And what is more fundamental is my individual sort of authentic experience, which is, that sense of personal authenticity is sort of the caricature of it in our modern world, but it's a representative caricature for a reason.
Yeah.
This may be too far afield. Have you seen The Witch?
Yes. Well, okay. No.
Sorry.
I know what you're talking about. I don't know why I said yes. That was a knee-jerk reaction. I know the movie. It's spelled with two V's. Yes.
Yeah, and of course that's how the W is.
No, that's how it was before. It was two V's.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not a foolish little marketing.
No. That's
that's them actually knowing something.
That's right. And the director is brilliant. I have not seen, the same director also did a movie called The Norseman.
Yeah, I saw that. That was okay.
I have not seen it, but I've read about it, and it's supposedly an incredibly authentic portrayal of
interesting
Viking history and culture.
Okay, cool.
I can't attest to that personally, but the Witch is fascinating. I don't know exactly if I should ever recommend it to anybody because it's horrifying.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know in good faith if I could recommend it to somebody, but
yeah, I would not recommend it to everybody. I'd want to caveat it because there are certainly things that I don't know if I should see, but that I saw in that movie. But it's set in the 1700s in America.
Yeah.
Amongst Puritans who have come over. The language is amazing. This is why I watched the movie, because the language is basically verbatim from like notebooks and journals from the period. So it's lots of these and thous and wonderful dialogue. It's basically everything that the Crucible. Are you familiar with the Crucible? It's the retelling of the Salem witch trials.
Dude, that sounds so familiar.
Yeah, it's a very popular high school.
I can see the font of the title in my head.
It's everything that play wanted to be, except it couldn't because it was reactionary propaganda.
Yeah.
Which makes for crappy literature.
Yeah.
But,
who would have thought?
One of the things that interests me about The Witch is that it starts with the father of this family being excommunicated.
Right.
Because he's an outsider. He's, we're not told why, but for some reason he's cut himself off from the church and the community. And then they go off and bad things happen.
Right. Well,
no spoilers, but bad things happen.
Yeah, bad thing. I mean, I think you and I view them as bad things. I think that I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen, I've read I read the screenplay for the movie, and I read the when I think there's something in a movie that's just abhorrent and I shouldn't engage in, that my move is to read the screenplay, because I can generally read a screenplay way faster than the movie can play out.
Yeah.
And so it's just better anyways. But I with all the A24 movies, like I think that I don't think he meant to portray it as bad. Interesting.
I think it comes across as a very negative portrayal in the film.
Yeah, I think
I don't think you're left at the end of the film. It's one of the most despairing films I've ever watched.
Yeah, I think we see it that way.
Yeah,
but I think that someone removed from our experience of the world, just non-Christian, I don't think that they experience. You have to first assume that the death of a family member is inherently bad to you, to assume that movie's portraying something bad happening.
Okay. Maybe I just cannot imagine the worldview of a person who would not find it despairing enough to appreciate that.
I think that there's a shocking number of people. I don't think it's a common experience of the average person to have that, but I think it's a very like eyes wide shut style. I think that there's a particular set of individuals that those particular types of movies are made for.
Oh, interesting.
That are almost even and I would the argument I would lean on to make this is that I think I don't have any. This is an insane claim to make, actually. I don't have any sort of actually, that's not true. That's not true at all, actually. I have quite a large amount of formal training in the world of storytelling and in writing and stuff like that, and particularly a lot of formal training in the world of people writing stories that look one way and are made to look that are made to look one way and are another. Because that's what I did. I was a journalism major in college, and I existed in the world of people going, well, listen. Average people, they don't get it, so we have to do this little thing where we go like this, whatever. And so I feel like we're way off topic at this point, but I would make the argument that guy knows what he's doing, and maybe even to a normal person who's just a non-Christian, that would appear bad. But I do not think. I think it's the same thing as arguing from a point to a Muslim that like. I don't know, something a Muslim doesn't think is bad, being like, it's like that thing that you already don't think is bad.
Yeah.
That thing you're doing that I think is bad, I'm going to make it analogous to this other thing you don't think is bad.
Right.
Like, it's just not there's something like that. Okay. But anyways, that totally derailed us.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Well, yeah, so...
what was your point about the movie?
The entire example, I mean, I do think it's a fascinating movie, but that was all off to the side. The main point was just the isolation of the family from the community, the sense that like you don't break off from the church, you don't break off from the community to find your full self in the authentic expression of your religion, your relationship with Jesus Christ, which is how both the most pervasive apostates talk, who maybe don't think they're apostates.
Yeah.
And how like your average evangelical Baptist talks.
Yeah.
In fact, what you find is death and the devil.
Right, the devil. Yeah. And I mean, I guess it's so funny. I can't resist. I think that's the how much do you know about Hannah Arendt?
A little bit.
Are you familiar with her concept of the found family?
No. Or I've forgotten if I did know.
It's this idea that if you cannot be accepted for how you are, and I think I have no idea what the context she was arguing this in, but I would imagine that it's something to do with homosexuals. If you cannot be accepted by who you are by your family, you can leave them and go into the city and find a family who will accept you there. I think that's kind of the point he was making was that it's okay to sacrifice your family to the devil if it means finding yourself. Because there's that scene in the end where she's elevated up with him.
Interesting.
And the devil is there and he comes in. Like, she transcends. Does she not? There's that end where the devil arrives and is like, and she embraces him fully and accepts herself. And
yeah, but I don't think the movie, man, so that's really interesting. I still don't, I'm not convinced. I'm really unconvinced.
Fair. That's fair.
Because it is a kind of transcendence, but it's a transcendence into something that the movie has already established is outside the bound. It's outside the community. It's outside the and you only get there through violence and misery and suffering. And it makes sense for the character.
Yeah.
At that moment, because she's been dragged out by her family, who, especially the father figure, who prioritized his own standing, his own beliefs, his own idiosyncrasies.
Yeah.
In the face of a community that was like, actually, no, man, you need to believe certain things.
Yeah.
Because those are good. And he's like, no, I'm going to go out to the wilderness and I'm sure it'll work out well for my family. And his family's constantly like, no, we want to go back. We want to go back to the town. And he's like, no. So the film, I don't think it celebrates that. It's just that's sort of the natural, rational outworking of
you're saying the director's more observing this sort of process.
That is my impression.
Okay.
I've only watched it once, but I watched it very carefully because I found it fascinating. Yeah. And the language is incredible. I'm going to,
for the sake of staying on topic,
okay,
I'll say that's, but what I will say is I now have a whole new idea to pitch to you after this.
Okay.
Okay. So yes, this idea that people are being brought out of the community, there's this broader community sense. There's this, there's a lower level of thoughts about yourself as an individual. You're not relating to your religion so much as you're at an individual level. Yet we have this incredibly warlike society in the medieval era. Yeah. These people who are constantly killing each other. Yeah. Is there anything that gives you insight into their motivations, their justification for that behavior? Because the individual aspects of modernity or whatever, while I think it might be a facile argument to say that it's less warlike, at least over geographic areas, it does seem to be that there are huge swaths of human population that are not fighting amongst each other, given a much more individual mindset. Mm-hmm. So how does that, I guess to return to my original question is there anything in these stories that lends credence to or gives us a window into the mind of these people as they're navigating through justifying these wars to themselves, justifying these wars to each other? Mm-hmm. What are their motivations? I guess those are a couple of my questions there.
Yeah. Justifications vary a lot depending on the kind of story that is being told. I think a lot goes into it. Stories that come out of the Crusades, for instance. Song of Roland.
Okay.
very enthusiastically justifies. I mean, I consider myself a non-woke person.
Yeah.
And yet they're like there's a line in the poem that maybe is just really bad in translation, so it sticks out to me. It's like Christians are right, Muslims are wrong. Like, let's go kill them.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's bad poetry. It's not good theology or philosophy. But there's a really cavalier sense about human value.
Yeah.
And I think we can only say this as very modern people. And to some respects, I think this is like one of the ways that I think there has been progress in moral thought is, for instance, how we think about children.
Yeah.
Which it's very hard to read the sources, read literature, read letters, read poetry, and think that the average medieval person had a really robust conception of the humanity of children.
Okay.
Which makes sense in a world where, you know, half of them are going to die in infancy.
Sure.
Or in older age. Right? Many of our authors had families. They had 17 kids, and 3 of them survived. And some of them might have survived up to, 15, 20 or whatever. But there's just a lot of death.
Yeah.
And that has to, I imagine, jade you to the sense, a real palpable sense of the value of each individual. It's hard to wrap my head around, especially living in a world where I think the Christian consensus in general is very pro-child, pro-life,
sure,
based on a relatively, maybe this is incorrect, but it seems to me a relatively modern commitment to the absolute equal value of every human life.
Yeah.
Regardless of size or shape.
Right.
From embryo to old age.
Sure.
And so there's just there's maybe also a commitment to the sense that this world is really not ultimate. Like, I can go and for whatever political reasons, maybe it's just that my king has said, hey man, you've got to take up arms against my enemy.
Yeah.
So I'm in Italy and I'm gonna go invade France for whatever reason. I know that these guys are worshiping the same God that I am, and we got to go kill a bunch of them,
I have
or get
orders.
killed by them.
Yeah.
And that's a shame, but
we're all going to the same place.
We'll
high five later. We'll be like, wasn't that so funny?
It'll work itself out in the end.
Yeah.
And we kind of saw the same thing in the modern period as well, and
right
wars.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's maybe not that foreign, but also as a person who's never taken up arms against somebody else, maybe it's just foreign to me.
Yeah.
Maybe in a world where that is just a reality, you have to, you think about it very differently than the average Joe who doesn't have to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's a real answer, but
no, I think it is a real answer. I think the idea that, I think both points there, that it is just, they just lived in a world of death. And so it does cheapen your idea of life, or at least just by necessity, you get a little more detached.
Yeah. But detached also, like the way we would frame that is you're repressing something that you're positively supposed to have. And
sure, yeah. I mean, maybe a sense of acceptance.
Yeah.
That life comes and goes kind of at the will of powers you can't control.
Yeah, and I think that's very well articulated, right? Like, we're all subject to forces we can't control, because there's also this really pronounced sense of hierarchy in the medieval world.
Yeah.
Like, everybody except the king and the emperor and the pope are subject to the king or the emperor or the pope or the lord or whoever it may be.
Yeah.
And I kind of have to do what I'm forced to do.
Right.
And there are repercussions for that, but the sense that I as an individual need to protest, like I need to stand up and say I'm a conscientious objector or something, is totally foreign. I mean, that's purely, as far as I'm aware, only comes out in the modern world, and maybe you see it at the earliest with Anabaptists.
Yeah.
But have you ever read Peter Pan?
Yes.
I love Peter Pan.
I love Peter Pan too.
And one of my favorite lines is when somebody asks Peter how many pirates he killed. And he says, "Oh, I forget him after I kill him."
Yeah.
Like, if you have to kill people, that's probably the way to do it.
That's probably the way to do it, is forget about them, yeah.
Not because we think less of them, but, if you are put into that moment, like, their lives they're not in my hands.
Right.
They're in God's, and I believe that really fundamentally.
Right.
Like, I don't just believe that in a sort of abstract way. I'm in God's hands. They're in God's hands. We're put into this world for a little while. We're all going to die.
Right.
Probably sooner rather than later, than as modern people we tend to think about. And God will take care of them.
Yeah, and that lends to, I think, to the second point that you made in the original answer, which is that it, these people did have a much greater sense of the afterlife.
Yeah.
Like, it just was like, this existence is probably did occupy such a space in their head that was so small relative to what they thought was coming.
Yeah.
That it probably didn't seem like it was that big of a deal that I'm sending this person to, like, if I'm killing somebody in France, like, I'm helping him out, like, send him up. Like, this dude's fine. He's chilling. Like, doesn't matter that I cut off his head.
I mean, there was a real sense that you might be sending them to purgatory for a long, long time.
Okay. But they get over it eventually. Yeah, they're chilling. They're fine.
But Dante captures that in his Commedia really well. Like, he's very concerned with mortal human life. In the world, but what is real, what is more fundamentally real, is what is after.
Yeah.
Like that, and it's hard to conceptualize that.
I think Lewis does it quite well. Is it The Divorce or whatever? The one where the people in hell take a bus to heaven?
Yeah, The Great Divorce.
The Great Divorce, and they come out of the bus and they can't even stand on the grass.
Yes.
Is that what happens?
That's right, because it's more real.
Right, it's more real.
Even the grass hurts you because you're just this shallow shadow of a creature.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I mean, I don't know how much time you got allotted for this, but I feel like this is a good amount of time to devote to the conversation. I think that's a very good place to end it. Is that maybe as much as I started the conversation saying, saying that I don't want to, like, romanticize or idealize people from the past. I want to acknowledge them as people, but maybe they were just people, but maybe they did have a greater sense of those things that are more real than we do currently.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think maybe as a way to try to wrap some of the things up, one of the coolest trends that I see in the development of medieval thought is this movement away from a real sense of despair in the classical world about how brief our life is and what we have to do with it. And you can see this through the later classical world as well, but Homer captures this viscerally, right, with characters like Achilles, for instance, who's like, well, I'm gonna stay here and fight because I know I'm gonna die, but at least I'll get glory.
Yeah.
And then in the Odyssey, Odysseus descends into Hades and encounters Achilles. It's like, oh, Achilles, you're so renowned and famous, and he's like, literally, this is hell. Like I would rather have anything than be in this waste, this non-existence. And the medieval just as a tangible result of a Christian vision of this world as important and vital, and yet not ultimate. You see a much more wholesome, like just really wholesome vision of life that can be grand and glorious, and you can do wonderful, heroic things. But it's not ultimate.
Yeah.
And you don't need to despair that it's not ultimate. Like, we're not just descending into Hades to mingle amongst the shades of human life. Like, there's a glorious hope.
Yeah, there's a glorious hope. Yeah, so yeah.
And yeah, so that theme runs through. I think it's maybe only at the very little bit hinted at in Beowulf.
Yeah.
But you go through like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, who's this robust Christian hero, who's and through later medieval works, where this is just a really tangible reality for them.
Yeah.
Just a fundamental to their vision of the world. I wish it were that fundamental to mine.
Yeah.
It's
certainly.
It's much more like, I choose to believe this because I think it's right, but I think this is just the background for most Christians in the medieval world.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so. Like, I know. Yeah, but yes, I mean, certainly, I think it is a profound judge of my own faith, almost, to think about it like that. Like, just how little we may consider what's going to occur after this, and how, because it does certainly as a modern Christian, it does still seem like this is the primary experience of my existence, even though it obviously will not be.
Yeah,
it's still very much in my mind is the thing I'm most concerned with.
Yep.
Yeah.
And yet, yeah, man, it's the more I go back and I read, the Pauline epistles, for instance, thinking about some of these things, that seems at the heart, right? Like if I don't think the resurrection is true, like, what do we have?
What do we have?
What fool I am. What is the point of this? Except that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, and we in him are raised, and this is not it.
This is not it.
Yeah.
I think that's I think a little bit of gospel is a phenomenal place to call it into it.
Sounds good.
I think that's great. Dude, I appreciate it. Thank you for giving me the time.
Yeah.
Thank you for lending some of your expertise to it. I think it was a good conversation. We'll see.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, I think we'll see what people think about it.
Did not go at all as I expected it to. So that was really
That's
good.
usually how you know it was a good conversation.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, good. All right, man, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.